Disability to inclusion. This discussion will be recorded and it will be made available to Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division members through the PALA CRD YouTube channel, as well as sent to registrants and available on the CRD blog. For this discussion, you'll only need a headset or speakers. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat box at bottom right throughout the discussion, and we'll include those questions at the end for Katie. We'll also do our best to assist participants with technical issues. Please post those issues in the chat box as well. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and the other Connect and Communicate Planning Committee members, including Andrea Pritt, Adam Balchunas, and Christy Adelman-Ritter. Please contact any one of the team for information about becoming a PALA member. This project is made possible by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services as administered by the Pennsylvania Department of Education through the Office of Commonwealth Libraries and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, Governor. And finally, I'd like to thank and introduce our presenter for today's event. Katie Quirin-Manwiller is the education librarian and assistant professor at Westchester University. She's chronically ill and dynamically disabled. Katie's scholarship focuses on improving disability inclusion in libraries through incorporating disability into diversity, equity, and inclusion work, addressing disability misconceptions, and creating accessible work environments. She's currently pursuing a second master's degree focused on strategic disability inclusion in higher education. Welcome. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Katie.
I missed the unmute button. Thank you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Disability in Academic Libraries, moving from accessibility to inclusion. I want to thank Andrea and the College and Research Division for inviting me to present to the Connect and Communicate webinar series. As a member of the Pennsylvania Library Association, I'm very grateful for the resources and opportunity provided by the organization and the College and Research Division. I'm just going to hide the row of faces quick. Okay. Like Ronally so nicely introduced me, my name is Katie Quirin-Manwiller. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the education librarian at Westchester University. I am chronically ill and dynamically disabled, which means my disability fluctuates in severity over time. I live with a number of illnesses, primarily hypermobility Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, despite appearing perfectly healthy to most people. If you read the very popular book on TikTok, Fourth Wing, which I actually haven't, but I'm aware of it, the main character of that book and the author have EDS as well. So current representation. My disability impacts my experience in libraries as an employee and patron, as well as an advocate for LIS workers with disabilities. You can reach me via email, and unfortunately, I'm no longer on Twitter, where a lot of library disability conversations used to happen, but I am on Blue Sky at librariankqm.bsky.social, and I help run a Discord for library workers with disability, which is the CripLib Discord. I will also note that I'm in the midst of a bad asthma flare, and I may need to stop to cough, but I'm going to try my best. Okay, before we dive into the content of the webinar, I want to ask you a question using Padlet. I'm going to put a link in the chat and I'll open it. Excuse me, you can use the QR code as well. But what does accessibility mean in your library? You can scan the QR code, click the link we're adding to the chat now to open the Padlet. It's padlet.com/kmanwiller/access. I'm going to open it up too. So once here, you should open this page or see this page. And you can answer this question by clicking on this plus symbol in the bottom right, typing your answer and hitting publish. Did we get the link in the chat? Okay, post it again. I see little bubbles coming up. Hopefully folks are starting to jump in. If anyone has any issues opening it, let me know, please. Okay, here we go. Folks are starting to come into the Padlet and posting what accessibility means in their library. So far, we have one post saying that they usually talk about it in terms of economic accessibility. So how financially accessible library resources are, academics in general, access of spaces and content for all, physical accessibility, so ensuring that elevators are working, there's ample space to move around the stacks, accessible bathrooms. Oh, sorry, I thought I got the layout where it all populated at once, but apparently I did it in a big line. Ensure use of the library services, resources, and spaces. Physical accessibility of collections. Can people reach the books in the stacks? Great one. Many things, primarily physical accessibility to spaces and collection, and text word affordability. So that economic accessibility is something that's coming up well. Another person is completely virtual. So it largely means making sure we follow the WCAG. We're talking primarily about the ADA today, which does not include anything about web accessibility. The law's a bit outdated that way. Some people see it as open to any and all persons regardless of ability or disability. Access to all of our resources and spaces. Let me see if I can quick change this setting to make it so that we can see it all. Because I thought I had this set up. Oh, here we go. That's what I wanted. There we go. Sorry about that, folks. Okay. This makes it a little bit easier. Holding events both in person, but public and internal, online and in hybrid mode. That's the way to make things accessible. Making digital books usable for everyone. Access of spaces and content. Can students and patrons access our material off-site? Spaces that can be used regardless of disability status. And making sure that users can comfortably access library materials. So by and large, these responses focus around physical accessibility of the building, accessibility of the materials in the building, like can you get to our collections, and some in terms of financial accessibility for our college students, and then kind of just an overall sentiment of access for all. I'm gonna switch back to my slide. Okay, the reason that I posed this question and why I am framing this conversation about moving from accessibility to inclusion, because in library work, we struggle with a comprehensive understanding of accessibility. We have a very narrow view of it. In most of our professional discourse, it is equivalent to ADA compliance. For example, in 2016, Cumbier and Starkey reviewed ALA's documentation about disability and found that, quote, what matters most is meeting specific measurable goals and treating a given concern, for example, diversity or accessibility, as a problem to be solved through reaching performance indicators. They go on to say that, quote, in other words, the assumption is that when we have done things A, B, and C, we have achieved diversity or accessibility, and hence are free to go about our business as usual with a clear collective conscience. They describe this approach as a tick box framework, where libraries approach accessibility only through compliance and not through a broader understanding of access for all. 5 years after that article, Gibson et al. Published a systemic review of disability and LAS literature that found similar, if somewhat more disheartening results. Quote, an appraisal of LAS landscape suggests an unprioritized and short-sighted understanding of disability. Much of the work sampled framed the discipline's struggle to provide minimally equivalent access and services as innovation. The quote continues, a large percentage of technology research focused on basic web accessibility and relied on self-referred or professional authorities. Few studies actually engaged disabled participants in ways that might influence the scope or design of the research. Fewer still considered intersectionality, Crenshaw 1990, and the experiences of disabled, BIPOC, and or disabled LGBTQIA people. This highlights the scarcity of training and education on disability issues, rights, justice, and accessibility in the field. I want to highlight again this portion of the Gibson article. Much of the work sampled framed the discipline's struggle to provide minimally equivalent access and services as innovation. Libraries for far too long looked at disability only in terms of what they are legally required to do by law. As a result, just meeting that legal requirement is seen as success when it is still falling far short of access or inclusion. Higher education more broadly has a very similar approach to accessibility, leaving academic libraries stuck in a basic framework despite consensus that more inclusion is needed. And not to knock anyone's understanding of accessibility, but that approach through physical accessibility and what we mean by that is generally chopped up to, are we ADA what's the word that I'm looking for? Compliant, that's the word, sorry. ADA compliant, which we can go beyond that, but that's usually the base that we're working from. In order to move us from this limited idea of accessibility to a broader disability inclusion, we have to first better understand what barriers to inclusion exist. Today, I'll summarize the Americans with Disabilities Act requirements that apply to academic libraries, discuss the limitation of these guidelines, and provide strategies to improve inclusion. There's a lot to cover today, so I want to be upfront that I have a resources list that I'll share at the end that I'm also continuing to add to for you to be able to have more information on how to implement these strategies. When I give talks about disability inclusion, I always ground the discussion in a reminder of what disability means for our society. Disability is a legal definition used to provide equal rights to an historically marginalized group of Americans. From the ADA National Network, quote, the ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. This includes people who have a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. The ADA Amendments Act of 2008 emphasizes that this definition should be interpreted in the broadest terms possible. This encompasses physical impairments that impact areas of the body, such as neurological, musculoskeletal, immune, digestive, endocrine systems, and any mental or cognitive disorder like intellectual disabilities, learning disorders, and mental illness. In the library world and much of American society, we view disability in very limited terms and often only think about it in terms of wheelchair users, deaf or hard of hearing folks, and blind individuals. But the legal protection goes far beyond this cultural assumption to include asthma, cancer, diabetes, epilepsy, heart disease, migraines, complications from pregnancy, thyroid gland disorders, and more. Despite the stereotype of disability that is pervasive in our culture, disability in reality is far more common and often not visibly apparent. I want to stress again that this is a legal definition used to ensure equal rights, and this may not match a person's individual choice to identify as disabled. A person may meet these qualifications, having an impairment that limits one or more major life activities, and not identify as disabled or feel that they are impaired enough to be considered disabled. Disability, however, is far more complex in reality than the legal definition appears, because it does not exist in a silo, and experience varies greatly depending on the way it intersects with other marginalized identities. In fact, disability is also more prevalent among people experiencing other forms of marginalization. The CDC reports that 2 in 5 Native Americans and Alaskans live with disability, as do 1 in 4 women. Sins Invalid, a performance group of queer disabled people of color, have been foundational in developing the concept of disability justice, which builds on the work of the disability rights movement to address the intersectional oppression experienced by multi-marginalized people. This is primarily because ableism is inherently part of white supremacy. In their explanation of disability justice, adapted from Patty Burns, Sins Invalid writes, quote, the history of white supremacy and ableism are inextricably entwined, created in the context of colonial conquest and capitalist domination. One cannot look at the history of U.S. slavery that is deemed less worthy, abled, smart, or capable. A single issue civil rights framework is not enough to explain the full extent of ableism and how it operates in our society. We can only truly understand ableism by tracing its consequence connections to heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism, end quote. Within libraries, disability often gets regulated to ADA compliance efforts and not woven through equity, diversity, and inclusion work. But we cannot equitably account for disabled experiences without acknowledging the complex identities that contribute to exclusion in our libraries. Disability intersects with a person's race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and age, all of which impact the way an individual experiences ableism in the workplace, as a student in an undergraduate institution, or a library user. To be an inclusive and accessible academic library, we must address the barriers that exist for people with disabilities through complex EDI efforts that also address the needs of other underrepresented groups. While these definitions ground our understanding of disability, I find the numbers really help people conceptualize just how common disability is in the United States. The CDC estimates 1 in 4, or 26% of American adults live with at least one disability, making disabled individuals one of the largest marginalized communities in our country. It's important to note that this estimate is prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, which we know has increased disability in the United States. The CDC estimates 1 in 5 adults will experience long COVID or an onset of a new disability per COVID infection, increasing disability in both the short and long term. Unfortunately, employment is often out of reach for disabled folks. Only 19-ish% of Americans with disabilities were employed in 2021, and ALA reports only 2.9% of members self-identifying as disabled in their demographic study. It isn't entirely clear how representative that number is of our profession, considering many librarians aren't ALA members, and not everyone who legally qualifies as disabled identifies as such. The ALA demographic study also only asks, do you have a disability, without defining disability, which likely leaves out many experiencing chronic or mental illness. Even with those potential explanations for the low percentage, it does appear disabled people are underrepresented in our profession, potentially even more so than the workforce at large. When considering our students, 19.4% of undergraduates and 11.9% of graduate students live with a disability. These numbers have been increasing during the 2000s and will likely continue to do so as a result of the pandemic, both in terms of things like more online education opportunities and the rise of disability more broadly. With a better understanding of the diversity of disability, we can take a closer look at the ADA in academic libraries and why it's important to why it is limited in the amount of accessibility it provides. Excuse me, I'm going to grab another cough drop quick. Sorry. Okay. There are 3 areas I'm going to cover: physical spaces, student access, and employee access. Also, apologies about the cough drop. It's like the only way I can talk without coughing for a long period of time. These 3 areas are covered in the ADA to varying degrees. When thinking about these requirements, it's important to remember that the ADA is the bare minimum legally required by law. Often libraries fall into the trap of proudly upholding the ADA, but it functions the same way as other civil rights law do in higher education. So as a comparison, Title IX is the legal minimum requirement for gender inclusion in higher education, and just adhering to that law is not a great advancement. The ADA is the floor, and accessibility is the ceiling we're reaching towards. Let's start with building requirements, since physical accessibility is one of the things that came up most in our initial discussion, and it's often where libraries encounter the ADA first. The ADA requires buildings that provide public accommodations to be accessible. It establishes minimum requirements for a host of things, such as the width of walkways and doorways, ramp access, accessible parking spots, height of counters and light switches, accessible door entries, appropriate signage, and accessible bathrooms. There are a lot of resources online that detail what these requirements are, and I have some linked in our resource document. While the implementation of these requirements were a huge step forward for the disability rights movement, they have not stood the test of time. The law became outdated quickly and was updated with new building requirements in 2010. But the biggest hurdle for academic libraries is the existing facilities portion of the law. New buildings have to be built to these standards, but older buildings only have to be updated where it is, quote, readily achievable. This means that it can be accomplished without much difficulty or expense relative to the size and finances of the organization. As I'm sure most of you know, it is not easy to get funding in higher education for major changes to library buildings. There is always a new science center or a new dorm or an old dorm that is full of mold that needs to be taken care of first. As a result, many academic library buildings have a patchwork of attempted updates that just barely meet ADA requirements, if at all. For example, at my library, There are railings in some of the bathroom stalls and a few that are supposed to be like the accessible stalls, but they're not accessible stalls in all bathrooms or even every floor. We have by and large the original 1960 bathrooms and an ever-present future renovation that should be happening soon, on which we're pinning our hopes for that increased accessibility. Unfortunately, there is really not much academic libraries can do in that situation besides being well-versed in how your library holds up. Even if your building was built after 1991 and meets those requirements, they are still the bare minimum and not always functional. For example, the ADA requires 36 inches or 3 feet wide aisles for wheelchairs to be able to pass. And while it can pass, it won't be able to turn around. In addition, the law is built primarily for physical disabilities and access for mobility aids and does not cover things like sensory disabilities. As a library-specific example, the ADA doesn't have a requirement for like how to fill a bookshelf because of space, and because of space, we often go from the floor to the highest shelf. But going up and down to get books off the bottom shelf is very difficult for me due to joint pain and dysautonomia. It is something that does not appear to be a barrier because I can still technically pull a book, but it does mean that I have limited access to it. Student access in higher education is not as clearly defined as the law as the building is. The Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act covers special education in K-12, but for post-secondary education, students fall into a few categories. Public universities are discussed in Title II of the ADA, private universities in Title III, and anywhere that takes federal funding must meet Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. These different bits of laws basically say universities and other institutions of higher education cannot deny accommodations to students. Students on accommodations themselves are not detailed in the law, but generally adapted from employee accommodations, which are, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a bit. Students can receive individual accommodations for academic, programmatic, and physical access through disability service offices on campus, as well as other offices. Usually, student housing would handle requests for accessible rooms and service animals, etc. How this process works is a student would go to their disability service offices with their access need, including bringing medical documentation of that need, and work with the office through what is called the interactive process to determine what accommodation can be made to meet their needs. This is strictly an individualized process that is decided on a student-by-student basis. These are things like more time on tests, flexible deadlines, altered attendance policies, access to class materials in advance, note-taking, captioning, interpreters, etc. A key part of this law is that the accommodation cannot fundamentally alter an academic program. So some universities, for example, will not allow flexible deadlines as accommodation at all. Once the student and the disability office have determined an appropriate accommodation, it is then usually the responsibility of the student to inform every single faculty member for every course they take of their accommodation. This often looks like sending them a letter notifying them of their accommodations and assuming the faculty member would adhere to that request. This individualized accommodations process is the primary, if not only, form of disability inclusion for students on college campuses. The primary limitation is that the majority of students with disabilities never inform their universities that they have a disability, meaning they cannot request accommodations. According to the National Center for College Students with Disabilities, only one third of undergrads inform their campus of their disability. And that is the first step in requesting accommodations. It doesn't even guarantee that the students would receive them. There are a number of barriers to requesting accommodations. First and foremost, many students simply do not know how to navigate the process or lack the formal diagnosis necessary to receive accommodations. In addition, students struggle with receiving inadequate support from disability offices and faculty, accommodations being inadequate for their needs, having to repeatedly disclose to the faculty, having to repeatedly disclose their disability, which is a draining process, facing stigma or discrimination from faculty and peers, and a host of other issues. And even if disabled students are granted adequate accommodations, you as a librarian are very unlikely to know that those accommodations exist unless you're teaching a 4-credit course. As such, the current model of accessibility through ADA compliance for students does not really reach them in our libraries. Like students, the primary form of accessibility for employees is the ADA accommodation process. This is defined by the Office of Disability Employment Policy as, quote, a reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a job, the work environment, or the way things are usually done in the hiring process. These are things like change of job tasks, providing reserved parking, improving accessibility in a work area, like through seating or spacing, providing an adjusted product, equipment, or software, allowing a flexible work schedule, including remote work, providing an aid or service like captioning, or reassigning to a vacant position. The key to understanding this process is the word reasonable. The employer is who gets to decide if an accommodation request is unreasonable, usually meaning it's outside a person's job duties and would change the nature of the position, or it would be very expensive to carry out. This process is not straightforward, and it's not about finding the best solution for the disabled employee, usually. Most people, disabled and not disabled alike, are completely unfamiliar with it unless they've had to go through it. There are specific steps for employer accommodations outlined in the ADA that, like I mentioned, are generally adapted to students. First, an employee or supervisor recognizes the need to make adjustments. Then the employee obtains a letter from their doctor outlining their needs. All this has to say is that they have a medical requirement for a certain accommodation, and that's what's required by law, but employers can ask for more medical documentation. After providing documentation that accommodation is needed, the employee engages in a negotiation process with usually the human resources department for an academic library or a library director if that's not appropriate. In higher education, we have the disability services offices, but they don't really handle employees. The employer then decides if the accommodation request is obvious, meaning does it not need any negotiation? So an example of that would be a wheelchair user needing access to a desk that can accommodate them. If it's not obvious, they engage in the interactive process with the employee to determine what sort of accommodation to implement. If you submit an accommodation request for a recognized disability, you legally cannot be denied that interactive process. During it, they discuss the concerns of the employee, identify potential accommodations, and assess what would work best for that position. And again, this is where the idea of reasonable comes in. For example, if you normally work at the circulation desk, but the bright lights and noise give you a frequent headache, and a position in cataloging happens to open, an accommodation could be to move you there. You have less interaction with patrons and more control over things like lighting. But the inherent position description, so in that example, you're moving positions, but the position at the circulation desk can't be fundamentally changed. A position description can be changed under, sorry, I lost my place. Okay. The timing to move into an open position is tricky, and unless an employee takes the opportunity of requesting an accommodation at that time, it's unlikely to happen. Often a doctor will recommend a specific accommodation, but the employer does not need to go with that option as long as they're meeting the same needs. However, the Job Accommodation Network, which I linked in our resources and is the main place you want to go for information on accommodations, they recommend adopting the accommodation an employee wants wherever possible. Once the accommodation is determined between the employee and employer, the employer informs the supervisor, who must keep the accommodation confidential. This means not even disclosing that the employee has received a formal accommodation, because that discloses that the employee has a disability. It's up to the employee to decide if, how, and when they will disclose their disability or accommodation to coworkers. If a supervisor is asked about another employee having an accommodation, like why does that person get to work from home sometime now or get a new chair, the supervisor cannot state that it's because of a disability accommodation. They basically have to say something along the lines of, we make individual adjustments as needed to support our employees' work, but prioritize their privacy. And when I'm talking about they must keep it confidential, I mean legally required to. Lastly, the accommodations are monitored, meaning employees spend some time adapting to the adjustment to see if it fulfills their access need. If not, you go back to that process and adjust accordingly. This is a very condensed version of a complicated process. I give full hour talks on the accommodations process, and I'm happy to answer accommodation specific questions either here or one-on-one via email. But just know this is a very condensed version, and I have a linked example of one of my bigger accommodations talks in the resources page. There are a number of barriers to receiving accommodations for disabled library workers. The process should help close the gap for people with disabilities, but in reality, they barely do. A 2019 disability supplement in the Department of Labor's current population survey found that only 15% of people with disabilities surveyed sought accommodations. Many people, including those with disability, are unfamiliar with the process as a whole and might not know what to ask for or if they even qualify. This process is rarely explained, if not specifically sought out. For example, I've never seen it explained in an onboarding HR process. In addition, HRs often want what is easiest and most beneficial for the institution, not what is actually the best for the employee. Academic library workers would go through that institution HR for formal accommodation and have to work within a system that's there to protect their larger university employer and not often them. In addition to the difficulty inherent in the process, accommodations put employees with disabilities in a very precarious situation. It requires disclosure of disability to some degree. Disclosure is an extremely personal decision, and many fear retribution or discrimination if they disclose. Library workers may not feel safe enough in their place of work to disclose their disability, even if they would benefit from having accommodations. This is especially true for library workers from other marginalized groups. As I mentioned, disability does not exist in a silo. For library folks already experiencing microaggressions or worse in the workplace because of their race, sexuality, gender, disability accommodations may be too much of a risk to pursue. Receiving accommodations also opens workers up for social and professional repercussions from supervisors or colleagues who perceive their accommodations as special treatment or do not believe the disabled employee needs them. If you're interested in learning more about how badly this process can go in academic library, I highly recommend J.J. Pianki's article, The Impact of Disbelief on Being a Library Employee with a Disability. In my linked presentation, I also talk in depth about my experience with human resources and the problematic barriers that exist working with a human resources department. In my own research, I found that a number of academic library workers who could use accommodations do not match the number who actually request them. So that my personal research has held up to these concepts. In a 2020 survey of about 300 MIS holders in academic libraries living with invisible illnesses and or disabilities, 32% requested accommodations, but 53% said that the disability impacted their daily work. The difficulty of this process and the fear of workplace repercussions is a theme in the follow-up interviews that we've conducted with the survey participants as well. Okay, we're gonna hop back to Padlet. Now that we've talked about ADA compliance and the limitations to equating that with accessibility, I want us to pause for a few minutes to give you time to reflect on where your library could improve disability inclusion. I have a second Padlet here that you can use the QR code again. We're gonna put it back in the chat. Thank you. And I'm gonna open up and consider the problems I've presented so far and where you think your library needs the most improvement. Once we have those, in mind, I'm gonna go through some strategies that I have for increasing inclusion. So I'm gonna try to pop out. Here we go. Okay. So here's the Padlet. Again, we're gonna follow the same, adding in your thoughts here. And just reload it because I've had this open for a little bit. First post is documentation on a website, sharing a part of orientation, improve signage and stacks for assistance. Those are all great ideas. I actually talked about some of those, or will be. I'm gonna pause to cough while you all are posting responses. So okay, we need safer kick stools to grab books from higher shelves, more discussion about hidden disabilities, more space for movement, more areas with non-aggressive writing, more varied furniture, more flexibility is what I'm hearing from that one. My library needs mobility improvement. The door that leads to the fire escape has no push button. We have multiple students who are wheelchair users. Only one bathroom with a push button. Our institution needs a formal remote work policy. Our stacks are not accessible to wheelchairs or emergency personnel. HR transparency of the ADA accommodation process for employees, including training for unit managers. Accessible bathrooms, that's a big issue, right? We have old buildings and they are not at the top. Hiring, I don't think we even ask about accommodations when interviewing, inviting folks for interviews. We ask about dietary needs, but nothing further. Virtual services, librarians to help with screen reader access. Ensuring people have flexible work arrangements, work from home options, right, for staff, not just IT. Elevators having issues. Many doors don't have automatic openers. So again, even though we have these standards, we're not doing a great job. Not that we have so much control over the facilities of our building, right? We are very limited in that. But there are clear problems with both our buildings and our libraries as workplaces. A lot of our buildings were built in like the 60s or 70s and have not been worked on since then. Building updates, lighting, reference desk has stools only for employees. Oh, that's not great. Yeah, so we're seeing the two things that I find most interesting is some of this is we are like not, our buildings are like not great. We know that. But also, it looks like a lot of folks are struggling with workplace inclusiveness. And so I'm going to talk about students too, but we're going to talk about ways to kind of improve these things as a whole. So I'm going to pop back to my slides. So the approach, so now that we've talked about ADA compliance and its limitations, and the limitations we are having in meeting those, I want us to pause. Oh, wait, I'm reading the wrong part of my script, sorry. Okay, thank you all for reflecting on your own libraries for a few minutes. To address these gaps in inclusion, I want to reframe our thinking from compliance-based to incorporating universal design principles. So this is a quote from the Disability Opportunities Internetworking and Technology Department, which is called like the DO-IT department of the University of Washington. Quote, universal design means that rather than designing your facility and services for the average user, you design for people with a broad range of abilities, ages, reading levels, learning styles, languages, culture, and other characteristics. Universal design was created as an approach to architectural design, which would be inherently accessible because it is including the needs of people with disabilities from the beginning. Focusing on accessibility from the beginning allows design to be more inclusive for everyone, regardless of ability. The common example is when you make a space that is wheelchair accessible, it's easier for everyone to navigate, like parents with strollers. By changing our focus on disability and libraries from compliance-based accessibility to integrating universal design from the start, we can provide actual inclusion beyond trying to meet those bare minimums. There are 7 principles of universal design. The first is equitable use, meaning the design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. It avoids othering certain users and provides identical or equivalent use. Flexibility in use means the design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. It gives the user choice in how they interact to meet their personal access needs. Third is simple and intuitive use. The design is easy to understand regardless of user experience, language skills, concentration levels, etc. It eliminates unnecessary complexity. 4 is perceptible information, which means the design communicates necessary information. I don't know why that was hard. Communicates necessary information effectively, regardless of the space's conditions or user sensory abilities. It allows for different modes of presenting information. 5 is tolerance for error, which means the design minimizes hazards and adverse consequences of unintended actions. This means things like providing warnings of hazards or errors and providing fail-safe features. 6 is low physical effort. The design can be used effectively and comfortably with minimum fatigue. Lastly is 7, size and space for approach and use. The physical space has enough room for approach, reach, manipulation, and use regardless of a user's body size, posture, or mobility. These principles were established again for architectural design, but they can easily be applied to more than just buildings. I want us to think about how our libraries can embody these principles to ensure that not just our buildings are accessible, but our services, programming, learning environments, and workplaces are accessible for students and employees. With these principles in mind, I'll talk through how libraries can apply them to spaces and through concepts like universal design for learning and universal design for the workplace. Providing inclusive spaces can be tricky for academic libraries because we only have so much say over our buildings, like we've talked about. The primary challenge to meeting accessibility standards and going beyond that is that we are at the whim of our larger institution for funding and priority when making major changes to our buildings. And I know there's not a lot we can do about that. I have a few strategies to work within these limitations, though. The first thing to do if you're looking to provide better inclusion in your building is conduct an accessibility audit of your spaces. This is both in terms of figuring out if you're meeting that ADA bare minimum and where you can improve beyond that. There are a bunch of ADA and library specific ADA checklists for conducting audits that I have linked in our resources. They're just like a big document of checklists that you walk around your building and review it with. Once you have a firm handle on whether you're meeting federal regulations, you can look into how your building is being used to better understand how inclusive it is. Evaluate both student and employee use of space to see how inclusive. Try doing focus groups or surveys to learn more about the problems already existing in your building. As we've discussed, the experience of disability is very diverse, but our application of accessibility is not. When we talk to our students and employees about how they actually interact with spaces, we can identify barriers that we didn't know previously existed. The next step is going to be pursuing campus partnerships to improve your space where you can. You can work with your Disability Student Services and Diversity Inclusion Office to gather participants for an accessibility audit, for example, or to get expertise in conducting one if you would rather have someone else on campus help you do that. You'll also want to work with your facilities department to make whatever small changes you can. Things like changing furniture, moving shelving, adding in more outlets, etc. Those small changes, when you don't have the ability to make big ones, can help improve the accessibility of your space in the short term. And of course, keeping funding in mind if your building needs major changes to improve accessibility. This is why an accessibility audit is really important, so you have evidence to go to administration with, saying we need funding because these are all these problems. Is it impacting student success? Always just throw that in there, that you did an accessibility audit, your response from student is demonstrating that these products are having a negative impact on student success, and so you need money to improve it. Ensure you point out those needs in things like annual reports, discussions with administrators, to try to get on like the docket for future projects or a part of any capital campaigns your university is doing. Lastly, when we do have the opportunity to make changes in our spaces, we want to incorporate universal design into that space strategy. What does that look like? This is from DO IT, again, the Disability Opportunities Internetworking and Technology Department of the University of Washington. They have what they call UDHE, Universal Design in Higher Education. And these are their steps to applying that to spaces. The first is to identify the space and best practices in the field. Are you just changing your library instruction classroom, or are you conducting a large-scale renovation? Are you doing things in-house, or do you need an outside space planner? The next step is to consider the diverse characteristics of potential users. This is why we do those accessibility audits, incorporating feedback from students and employees. We want to go beyond that surface level understanding of disability to reach our actual campus needs. You want to consider the unique population of your campus. So for example, Westchester has a program specifically for autistic students, so meeting sensory needs are essential for our library. Third, you integrate universal design with best practices in your field or campus space design, but for us, it's library design. So if you're doing any sort of major renovation and using a library space planner, be sure to look for one that incorporates universal design into their architectural design and is up to date on accessible best practices. Fourth, you want to plan for accommodations. Understand that even with the most inclusive design, students and employees will need accommodations to meet their access needs. Ensure you have an established and easily identifiable system for users to request access assistance. Last is to evaluate. Once your space is updated and has been in use for some time, do another accessibility audit and see what barriers still exist or what might newly exist that you can change going forward. While ensuring inclusive space design is essential to how students use the library, we also want to incorporate universal design into the learning that happens in the building. You may be familiar with the concept of universal design for learning, an approach that adapts universal design to the classroom through three primary concepts: multiple means of representation, or what students learn; multiple means of engagement, or why students learn; and multiple means of expression, or how students learn. You may have encountered UDL through an educational organization called CAST, but their guidelines tend to be overwhelming and more confusing. So I'm going to kind of just simplify it for you all. Feel free to go look at them in more detail, but it seems a little much to me. So I recommend incorporating these principles not through a specific set of guidelines, but through broader UD concepts in mind. We want to ensure our instruction and programming are created with flexibility built in to allow students to engage with materials in the way that's easiest for them. For representation, that looks like having information for an instruction session in both a handout and a LibGuide, or providing written instructions along with a video tutorial. For engagement, you want to provide flexibility in the way students interact. So offer workshops in person and over Zoom. Use a variety of active learning techniques where students could both speak out in class or write down a response. For events, you could do multiple ways to physically engage. You want to avoid requiring all students to get up and move around for an activity, unless it's something like a library tour where you find you're unable to eliminate that. Lastly, expression tends to fall more into a full-length course instruction. It's like often the formative assessment, how you're going to complete a final assignment. But we can try to adapt this on a smaller scale with one-shot instruction through short assessments and involvement in course assignments. For example, if you have an asynchronous session posted to a learning management system, students could be asked to comment on it with their typical research process, or they could submit things like a 1-minute paper, concept map, short video clip. They could respond in different ways. You can also use similar techniques for library programming, where you're looking for student engagement. You could allow them to respond in person on a poster board to something, as well as on your social media. They're just a handful of examples because there's an ever increasing body of literature on UDL for academic libraries, which includes an upcoming book from ACRL on how to incorporate universal design for learning. It's called Universal Design for Learning in Academic Libraries, Theory into Practice. There are lots of resources out there to explore in terms of one-shot programming and information literacy courses. In addition to UDL, I have a few other tips to make your library an inclusive space for students with disabilities. When thinking about ease of use and perceptible information, we need to ensure students know how to access our spaces and services. This means have a very clearly labeled accessibility page on your website that details things like accessible parking and entrances, any accessibility, I'm saying that word too many times today, any accessibility technology you have in your library and how to request or access it, who to contact if they need accommodations for physical spaces, and any relevant programming you have. Our students need to be able to access this information to access our libraries inclusively. So don't bury it under multiple layers of policy pages. Again, I have resources on how to do that sort of thing on the resource page. As I mentioned previously, I highly recommend working with your Disability Services Office or other diversity offices where you can. This could be doing a separate library tour or information literacy session for students registered with the Disability Office, doing an open house on accessibility services you provide, or just ensuring that other campus offices know how to direct students to you. Lastly, ensure your students with disabilities can see themselves in your library. Include disabled representation in your collections, displays, programming. The same principles for representation of other marginalized groups apply to disability. Normalize it in your library and do not limit it to representation in historic months or only on marginalization. The last area we can apply universal design to is the workplace culture. University of Arizona Disability Resource Center has adapted universal design into inclusive workplace practices. These are flexibility in how, when, and where work is performed. Remember that it is very likely that there are disabled librarians in your building that have not disclosed disability, so we do not want to rely on accommodations requests to meet access needs overall. In addition, these principles benefit everyone and can help prevent burnout and toxic workplace environments. How work is performed provides options in the physicality of work, like having employee have the option to sit at the circulation to check in titles and organize them in a cart while someone else puts them back on the shelf. Libraries obviously need coverage for specific hours, but there's still some opportunity for flexibility in when work is performed. Outside of scheduled desk shifts, you can get rid of the watch the clock mentality if possible. At my institution, library faculty generally start anywhere between 7:30 and 9:30 a.m. The when also includes things like longer or more frequent breaks and options for shorter work weeks with longer days. Lastly, flexibility in where work is performed is becoming much easier since COVID demonstrated library workers can successfully work from home. Remote work is far more accessible to many with disabilities than in-person work is, so allowing all employees some remote options makes your workplace culture as a whole more accessible. You can also provide flexibility in where work is performed within the library if your building allows. Some folks may need or work better in a private enclosed office or in more collaborative open areas. I know university human resources policies will supersede whatever we want to do in libraries. So not all this will be achievable for everyone, but we can still add in flexibility where possible, and library administration can advocate for more flexibility at the university level. We want to incorporate these principles for physical work environment, employee policies that the library has control over, the way we train our employees, and when we are hiring and adjusting positions. While the principles of workplace flexibility go a long way in creating an inclusive culture, it's also essential that libraries provide training on the accommodations process. Flexibility and in-house accommodations can go so far, but we have to prepare to assist our library workers through the formal process. To start, library supervisors and admins need to know how it works at your university. Your human resources, depending on how big you are, may have a specific web page or form for employees to fill out, or they just might have you schedule a one-on-one meeting. Supervisors need to have this info readily available to help direct employees should they come to you for help. In addition, there should be regular training on this process for employees. Like I mentioned, accommodations are not often included in HR or onboarding process, so that's a place you could do it within the library. You could reach out to HR and ask them to provide a training during a lunch and learn or staff development day. It's crucial that this information is shared to everyone with regularity. First, because most people, regardless of disability status, have no idea how to navigate it or that it exists. I've only had success with it because I specifically study disability in the workplace. If you don't know it's available to you, you aren't going to be able to use it. Second, disabilities change over time, and someone who may not have needed an accommodation does now. And third, an open discussion on how this process works, particularly in terms of emphasizing its necessity for an equitable work environment, helps break down the mystery and stigma around this process so that disabled employees do not get ostracized for their perceived special treatment. This goes a long way to normalize disability and inclusion in your workplace environment and to make it safe for disabled library workers. We are running out of time, and I want to make sure I have time for questions, so I'm going to kind of breeze over this last slide. But the main thing is that disability should be incorporated throughout your DEI work. I am hesitant to add an A to DEI for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, because accessibility in libraries, as our literature has shown, means ADA compliant, and I worry that libraries will just check that box and think, oh, we're being accessible. In addition, disability does not exist in a silo, so relegating it separately from other forms of diversity, equity, inclusion does a disservice to all of us. So we want to have comprehensive DEI work that incorporates disability throughout our programming, our planning, our policies. It should be throughout that process, especially with staff training as well. Now, as we wrap up, I just want to leave you with this rallying cry from the disability rights movement: nothing about us without us. It represents the need. This statement comes from around the time the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability was written. It asserts that people with disabilities know what is best for them. Remember this phrase if you're ever unsure how to improve accessibility or disability inclusion in your library. Center the voices of actual disabled people, include them in the decision-making process, and then defer to their experiences. Okay, I want to open up to questions now. I know we only have a few minutes. I'm happy to stay on if we have the ability a little longer, or you can email me questions as well. My contact information is here with the resources, but we can open up to questions now.
While people are adding some questions, there's a link to the evaluation survey in the chat. And we would really appreciate you taking the time to submit your responses, as we're required to submit evaluation data as part of our LSTA grant application. And I forgot to say, thank you, Katie, very much for that. So let's see. In the
I see in the chat one that our buildings have a lot of problems, and I know there's only so much we can do. So my best advice is documenting them and going to and again, trying to tie it to student success. That's the best way to get money in my experience. But Janelle has a question. Do you have an example of exemplary accessibility statements on library websites? On my resource document, I have an example from University of Wyoming Library has a pretty robust accessibility website. And there's also a link to a choice webinar by Dr. KT Vaughn on how to do that, like how to create accessible statements and links on your website. So there's resources for that there. Yeah. Any other questions for me?
I don't see any in the chat. Well, again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And Katie, thank you for presenting. Again, I hope you will take a few minutes to complete our survey and let us know your thoughts. As a reminder, the recording will be available to PALA members early next week on the CRD YouTube channel. And I invite you to contact me with your suggestions for future discussions and presentations. And I invite you to contact me if you would like to present. So have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.